the scriptures even tell us to be to preach the word, be instant in season and out of season. And this is 2 Timothy 4:2. And I'm sure you heard this verse before, where Paul is speaking to Timothy and telling him to be instant in and out of season. But you probably have heard it more, the word being constant in and out of season. But there's also the scripture that says instant. And I think this is such an encouraging scripture, and I've used it many times to even encourage myself during my own ministry. But before we get into the verse a whole lot, I want to be able to quickly set the backdrop of what's going on at this point in history, and when this verse is first given to Timothy and to us. And first of all, my little disclaimer is that I'm a history buff. I know I don't look like it because I'm so cute and fartsy, and I'm a musician, so what would I care about history? But if I get on Netflix, probably 7 times out of 10, I am watching some documentary on dynasties or empires or Roman empires and all this stuff. So if I get a little nerdy after a while, it's because of that. And I'm working on my doctorate in theology right now, so I pulled out a lot of my Greek and Hebrew, and I just thought I'd practice on you guys. Okay? All right. So here we go. So as you know, Paul wrote many books in the New Testament, and 2 of them being 1st and 2nd Timothy, which we all know are letters, right? But Paul wrote his second letter to Timothy during a very difficult season in Timothy's ministry. A few years earlier, the picture was radically different. And at that time, the church of Ephesus was growing and thriving. But what I want you to know was a very paganistic city, full of idolatry and sacrifices that were going on. But still, Timothy was having great success in bringing and winning these pagans over to Christ, and they loved their new pastor who came to help, and he helped transform their lives, and they just loved him. He brought them hope and peace, and those early years were fun and eventful, and everything was moving. Now, I know many of you have probably, who's been in ministry about 10 years or more? Okay, 20 years or more? All right, so you guys remember back in the beginning seasons when you're first starting out doing ministry, and you're like, you got all the stamina, and it's like, let's go, let's do it. And I'm sure you have some great stories how God showed up and people came to know the Lord, and you've got some miraculous accounts of how he provided when it seemed like impossible. Those kind of things. And you never got tired, right? You're just ready to go out and do ministry all the time. You just had all this incredible stamina. You stay up all night singing your songs and praying for people and repacking in the morning to go to the next little town. And you stop by Dunkin' Donuts and you get your little donut, your little white cream filled donut. And
Exactly.
Just me? Come on. Get your donut out. Come on. You count the steering wheel and you go straight on into the next town. And that's how it was for Timothy. He showed up to Ephesus with his donut, and people were getting saved. And there were so many conversions among these pagans. I mean, what an incredible and exciting time to be a Christian leader. But by this time, the 2nd Timothy was written, the situation had changed dramatically. Okay, and for this new pastor and for the believers under his charge. Because this was the time of Nero, the 6th emperor of Rome. And this is the background I really want to set for you guys as to what's really going on at this time. When Timothy, this young pastor, is taking off with all these conversions, but it's also the time of Nero. And he only reigned for a space of 5 years, but what havoc he created. If you know anything about Nero, a little insight to him that you may not know is that he loved to sing, play his harp, his lyre, and he loved to act. And he would bore people with his acting skills for hours and hours. He would entrap them in his little theater. I mean, they couldn't escape. I mean, he's the emperor. You think they're going to leave? No. He definitely was not ACT International material. But he was mostly known for his extravagant temper and the most atrocious barbarities. And at one point during his reign, he had ordered the city of Rome to be set on fire, in which the order was carried out by his officers and his guards and his servants. And I just think it's amazing because Rome was so beautiful and he set it on fire. And while the city was in flames, he went up to the tower and stood for hours watching in delight as it burned. And eventually he began to play his harp, and he sung a song about the burning of Troy. You remember Troy had burnt like in 1184 BC. And when Troy burned, they obviously had some kind of song about it. And so here he was singing the song about Troy burning. And while he was singing, he openly declared that he wished for the ruin of all things before his death. Mm. And thousands have died in that horrific fire. And it lasted for 9 days in July of 64 AD. And when it was all over, Nero, finding that the people hated him greatly for his conduct, he turns around and lays the whole blame at the feet of Christians. And for the next 3 years, he continues to blame them. And it finally starts to give him a license to start persecuting them. And the first great persecution of the church under Nero began in 67 AD. And the diabolical imagination of this man, he came up with so many extreme and cruel ways to persecute Christians. And some were fed to the lions for Romans for entertainment. Some he'd sew into the skins of wild beasts and then left them out on the streets for dogs to tear them apart. Other times he would dress them in stiff wax shirts and then nail them to trees and then set them on fire so that at night his garden would be illuminated. I can't imagine what it'd be like to live in those days or to be living in Rome during that time. And I won't go into it anymore, but just know this is one bad dude. And he laid the blame of all that he did at the feet of these new converts, these new believers. So the Christians who lived in Ephesus, they often endured bouts of intense persecution as the Roman government tried to scare them back into abandoning their faith and going back into their pagan temples. And because, that would solve everything. If you're getting fed to lions and everything else, and many of them, you think some of them went back to their old ways? Heck yeah. Many of them did. And it was during this beginning year of terror for Christians in 67 AD that Paul wrote the second book, Timothy, which again is a letter. But while he was writing it, he himself was in prison. So now Paul, being in prison was not a big deal. He's been in prison before, right? He's used to hard times. But this was his second time. And the circumstances of the second Roman imprisonment were quite different. Because from his first carceration was different because, he had his own hired dwelling and his friends could freely come and visit him. But now, at the climax of the Nero's reign, he is confined to a dungeon and friends could only see him with great difficulty. And actually, this is where they say he was in. This is really a cistern, too. This is located underground at the Mermentine Museum and was close to the Roman Forum about 2,500 years ago. This is supposed to be the actual prison he was held in. And when he first arrived there, because this is his second imprisonment, he had expected to be released, but later he looked for his death. Because in 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 7, he says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight." You've heard this, right? Mm-hmm. "I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." So he's alone in his cell and he's writing to Timothy, and only Luke is with him, and everyone else has left for various reasons. And Paul's immediate purpose of writing this letter was to issue an affectionate appeal to Timothy to come and visit him one last time. However, Paul's main concern, as always, was the welfare of the gospel and the welfare of this new church. And Paul's was always trying to give Timothy instruction for perfecting the organization of the church and for safeguarding of the gospel. And with the realization that his death is pretty imminent and that Timothy may not reach him in time for a final visit, Paul injected into his letter solemn words of admonition and warnings, and he urges Timothy, be faithful in the face of all these hardships and desertions and any errors that you even may be making. He urges him to be faithful because as a result of these horrific, hard times, church members were dying for their faith. Many of them were defecting from the church and had returned to the old temples to save their lives. And as if these hardships and disappointments were not mountainous enough to deal with, Timothy had to deal with some serious internal rebellion among some of the members of his church leadership. Because, see, Timothy had written a letter to Paul explaining all these difficulties, and Paul's response was 2 Timothy. And in this letter where he urges Timothy to remember to always be instant, in season, and out of season. So let's talk for a moment. What does this mean? The word instant is the Greek word SelfEsteem. Okay? It's a compound of the words epi and estemi. The word epi means upon, and the word estemi means to stand. You compound the compounded into one word. The new word means to stand up, as to take a firm stand or a hard position. It's a term borrowed from the military that actually meant to stay at one's post. Stay at your post, Timothy. Stay there. And Timothy's post was the pulpit of the church. Timothy's post was to maintain his leadership, to impart vision, to issue, rebukes, and to teach and preach the word and bring about correction. It was his post. And nobody else could stand in his post because it was the post that had been assigned to him by God. And so even though there were times that were very tough and he had been tempted to shun his responsibilities, Paul urged him to stay at your post. Remember, Paul told him to be faithful to his post, in season, out of season. Now, in the Greek, this looks like a play on words, but it's a very powerful statement to those of us who are doing our best to serve God. And so let's look at these two phrases. The word in season comes from the Greek word eukairos. The words out of season comes from the Greek word akairos. So you see how similar these two Greek words are? They're very, very similar. And as a teacher, I've been a teacher in metro schools and national schools for many years. And the first thing I do is I tell my kids, if you don't know a word, look at the root word. What's the root word? Kairos. Kairos is our root word. So in the Greek, kairos means a season of time. And when you add the prefix eu in front of it, it becomes eukairos. The prefix eu means good, happy, pleasing, or pleasurable. Put them together and the word transforms to eukairos. And it actually means good times, pleasing times, pleasurable times. But by changing the prefix to it turns into akairos. And it may look like a really insignificant change, but with that little letter, it radically changes the meaning to bad times. So when Paul told them to be instant in season and out of season, he's telling them to be faithful, whether it's happy times or it's bad times. I study a lot of Rick Renner. Y'all know who he is? No? What are y'all just Methodists and Baptists in here? Is there any spirit-filled people on my day? Come on. We're all spirit-filled, right? You see your hands, raise it up high, loud and proud. Rick Renner.
Oh, yeah.
I love Rick Renner. I study his materials a lot. He really gets into the Greek and the Hebrew of everything, and he really has some good stuff. I could read it forever. He gives a lot of insight to Greek translations, and he gives a wonderful interpretive translation of this verse of being instant, in season, and out of season. And I just really like his interpretive translation because it speaks to me so well. It says, take a firm stand and resolve to stay at your post. Regardless of whether times are good or bad, That is your post, your place of responsibility. So dig in, take a firm stand, and resolve that you are going to be faithful. And this was just the word that Timothy needed to encourage him to stand tall. Be brave and remain faithful to his assignment. And so his struggles eventually passed, and he became the respected leader of the Christians in the regions of Asia Minor. And in the years that he served as a senior pastor in Ephesus, Timothy had, different kinds of seasons, some good, some not so good, but regardless, he stayed at his post until the very believe. And I believe it's partly because of Paul's urging him to stay instant in season and out of season. Now, I know in our own ministries we haven't seen or experienced the kind of death and extreme demonic force that came against the church to extinguish it like Timothy did. But I know that if you've been in ministry or if you're just starting out, you will experience your share of demonic doing its best to discourage you, slow you down, distract you, even stop you from doing what God has called you to do. And that's because Satan, he's real. He's real, and he's pretty ticked off because he knows how the stories ends, right? But the only thing he can do is kick up some dust while we're on this side of heaven, because that's all he can do. He's not going to make it easy for us. He's not about to roll out the red carpet and say, have your way, present the gospel. He's going to be in your face, in your way all the time. And like I said, you won't see probably the same kind of extreme persecution that Timothy and his group did. But I guarantee you will see some persecution in one form or another, because Satan is the accuser of the brethren. And if he doesn't bring a physical force against you, he'll pull out his bag of tricks and pull something from within, an inner force, thoughts of insecurity, fears, doubts, words like, did God really call you to this? Right? He'll point out your faults, the sin that you struggle with. He'll tell you you aren't worthy of his calling. And sometimes that inner struggle, that's a real fight. That's a real fight. Because sometimes the inner struggle is harder than the physical struggle, because that's the stuff that keeps you up at night. Right? That's the stuff you're thinking about while you're driving down the road. There's all this inner turmoil. So what do you do with that? Years ago, when I first moved here to Nashville, it was a very exciting time for me. It was like 29 years ago. I can't believe that. I know, I don't look that old. But,
You were 2?
huh? I was 2.
It makes sense now.
It makes sense now. I love you. That's why you get to stay out for recess 5 minutes longer than everybody else. You've been really good, so you can stay out and play with them.
Oh, all right.
But anyway, it was a very exciting time when I moved here. But, although I had just moved to a city where any tree you shook, a musician or singer would fall out of, and I already dealt with self-esteem issues from childhood and family issues, I was still very excited about moving here. Because I had a very firm call on my life to pursue music and ministry, and the Lord had given me great affirmation to that calling over and over again. I wish I had the time to tell you about it, because you guys will go, wow, because it was like a big deal. But this low self-esteem and insecurity was something that followed me around constantly for the longest time. It often manifested even in depression and inner attack. Right? And where do you think that came from? Didn't come from my Heavenly Father. He thinks I'm great. He thinks I'm awesome. He displays all his gifts and talents within me for his glory. That doesn't come from him. I'm his handiwork. My purpose, as it is all of our purpose, is to bring glory to his son's name. But this constant nagging inner pain and thoughts of unworthiness just lying beneath the surface would raise its ugly head in the most unsuitable times during my ministry. But somehow, after a couple years of living here, I managed to do my first CD project, and I started traveling, doing concerts. I had band members and backup singers, and I was loving doing ministry through music and testimony. And it wasn't long before I was offered a record deal with a very prominent record label here in town. And they took my manager and I both out for dinner one night, and the next day my manager told me that they wanted me on their label, but they wanted me to lose 20 pounds. And I look just like this right now when they said that. And that killed me. I mean, it killed me. And I didn't know how to handle that, really, because I kept thinking, what? I mean, I'm doing ministry. Who cares what I look like? I mean, if I'm like this perfect little figure up here, what's that going to say to the person in the audience who's not perfect? You know, oh yeah, look, she can sing. She's got a record deal, yeah, because she's perfect. It looks good. Oh, it's never going to happen for me because I'm like this. And I couldn't understand that kind of mentality. I couldn't get it. And then all those thoughts just came rushing back in, and that insecurity monster that was just lying dormant just below came forth and whispered, if a Christian label tells you you aren't good enough the way you are, then you aren't good enough, period. And I got to tell you, that inner battle began all over again. And the problem was when their voices began to speak like that. And I was dealing with some other real issues with the Christian music industry. The problem was that I didn't stand my ground. And eventually I completely walked away from my calling because it just hurt too much to stay there. I couldn't stand the rejection. The Christian industry wasn't very accepting and certainly wasn't very nice, so I left it. And I went back to teaching school. Graduated from Auburn University and went to school with Bo Jackson, War Eagle. I have my elementary education degree. I have a master's now in teaching kids in second language, ESL, so go back to teaching school, why not? Seemed children were much more accepting of me than all those artsy-fartsy Christian producers and those that thought themselves leaders. And believe me, being a teacher stuck in a classroom with children was not my calling, but it was safer, right? It was safer. They never made me feel like I wasn't good enough. They'd wrap their arms around me and say, Miss Morlock, I love you. You're my favorite teacher ever. And I got lots of praise from parents and other teachers. Principals would talk about my high classroom scores during faculty meetings because I was a very effective teacher. Being a teacher is one of my gifts. Who knew? I didn't know that. I just felt trapped in a classroom. But I didn't know that I was effective. That was one of my gifts. I didn't know that. I had one principal ask me, to mentor other teachers in our school. And you would have thought that would have made me happy, but I wasn't happy. In fact, I was miserable. And I dealt with the misery by eating it. And I ate my way through the pain all the way up to 300 pounds. That'll show them. Tell me I need to lose 20 pounds. I'll just get fat. And I did. I was proud of it. No, I wasn't. I was miserable. That's misery. That's entrapment. That's bondage right there. That's not standing your post. That's not standing your post. I didn't stand my post. I didn't know how to fight for it. I didn't know how. I didn't know I was supposed to. I forgot all about the firm affirmation the Lord had given me about my calling, and I listened to other voices instead. So I left what I was called to do. I left the assignment. I left my post, and for the next 15 years, that's what I did. That and only that. I taught school. I didn't stop loving God. I didn't stop going to church. I didn't stop studying my Bible. I didn't stop my private worshiping. I was doing all those things I was supposed to do, and because of that, I was able to survive, but I was not doing what I was really supposed to do. I left my post. And let me tell you something. If you're not doing what you're called to do, be prepared to be bored. Because you are never going to be really fulfilled unless you're doing what you're called to do. And that inner struggle just came worse. And I so hated my job. Not the kids, but the job. I despised getting up every morning to go to work. And I remember one time I had worked in my classroom very late one night, preparing things for the next day, filling out paperwork. And I got home around 11 p.m. and simply exhausted from the responsibilities, putting in like 55 hours a week. And I remember pulling into my garage, and as I pulled in the garage, I reached up to close my garage door and to hit that remote. And I remember thinking, you know, I could just put the garage door down and keep the car running, and this will all be over. Mm-hmm. And I did. I pushed that remote, and it went down. And I rolled down the window to make it go a little faster. And I put my hands on the steering wheel, and I was going, God, help me to turn off my car. Mm-hmm. Help me turn off my car. Mm-hmm. You see how the enemy works? I wasn't nailed to a tree. I wasn't set on fire, but I was being persecuted. Right? And the pain of all those accumulating years had added up in such a way that it didn't take much convincing from my adversary when he whispered in my ear, you know, you'll never get any better than this. Your life will never be any better than this. This is your life. This is how it's going to be. You're never really going to be able to fulfill your music ministries. And look at you, you're 300 pounds. Who's going to take you seriously if you step on a stage and forget about a husband? Just leave the car running. Right? Oh, he's tricky. Wow, that kind of talking going on in my head, it's a wonder I didn't take myself out. But do you see what I would have missed out if the devil had talked me into cutting my life short? You know? All the people I wouldn't have had the opportunity to influence, you know, for Christ. I wouldn't be here with you now. You know? Well, I continued on a couple more years teaching because it was safe. And after 2 more years, I called my mom and I said, "Hey, Mom, I want to go ahead. I want to go ahead. Do you think you guys can support me while I change careers?" You know? "Oh, Mary Linda, don't you quit." It was like 2009, 2008. "Oh, the economy's so bad right now. Don't you quit? Don't you quit? You don't have another job, and you don't have a. You're still single. You're married." "Thanks, Mom." Just reminding me that I'm still single. I just love that about you. I love you. She's in heaven right now. She's like, "I hate when you do that." It did go down that way. Don't argue with me. It did go down that way. I'll never forget it. And again, I was convinced to go about and keep doing what I was doing and keep doing what I wasn't called to do.